Proof of the Pudding by Robert Sheckley. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. One man's fact is fantasy for another, except the man whose fantasies become solid fact. Proof of the Pudding by Robert Sheckley. His arms were very tired, but he lifted the chisel and mallet again. He was almost through. Only a few more letters, and the inscription, cut deeply into the tough granite, would be finished. He rounded out the last period and straightened up, dropping his tools carelessly to the floor of the cave. Proudly, he wiped the perspiration from his dirty, stubbled face and read what he had written. I rose from the slime of the planet. Naked and defenseless, I fashioned tools. I built and demolished, created and destroyed. I created a thing greater than myself that destroyed me. My name is man, and this is my last work. He smiled. What he had written was good. Not literary enough, perhaps, but a fitting tribute to the human race, written by the last man. He glanced at the tools at his feet. Having no further use for them, he dissolved them, and hungry from his long work, squatted in the revel of the cave and created a dinner. He stared at the food for a moment, wondering what was lacking, then, sheepishly, created a table and chair, utensils, and plates. He was embarrassed. He had forgotten them again. Although there was no need to rush, he ate hurriedly, noting the odd fact that when he didn't think of anything specific, he always created hamburger, mashed potatoes, peas, bread, and ice cream. Habit, he decided. Finished, he made the remnants of the meal disappear, and with them the plates, utensils, and table. The chair he retained. Sitting on it, he stared thoughtfully at the inscription. It's fine, he thought, but no human being other than myself will ever read it. It was fairly certain that he was the last man alive on Earth. The war had been thorough. Thorough as only man, a meticulous animal, could make it. There were no neutrals in this war, no middle-of-the-road policy. You were on one side or the other. Bacteria, gas, and radiations had covered the Earth like a vast cloud. In the first days of that war, invincible secret weapon had succeeded secret weapon with almost monotonous regularity. And after the last hand had pushed the last button, the bombs, automatically guided and impelled, had continued to rain down. The unhappy Earth was a huge junkyard, without a living thing, plant or animal, from pole to pole. He had watched a good part of it. He had waited until he was fairly sure the last bomb had been dropped, and then he had come down. Very clever of you, he thought bitterly, looking out the mouth of the cave at the lava plain his ship rested on, and the twisted mountains behind it. You're a traitor, but who cares? He had been a captain in the Western Hemisphere Defense. Within 2 days of warfare, he had known what the end would be. Filling a cruiser with canned air, food, and water, he had fled. In the confusion and destruction, he knew that he would never be missed. After a few days, there was no one left to miss him. He had raced the big ship to the dark side of the moon and waited. It was a 12-day war. He had guessed it would last 14, but he had waited nearly 6 months before the automatic missiles stopped falling. Then he came down, to find himself the only survivor. He had expected others to recognize the futility of it, load ships and flock to the dark side of the moon also. Evidently there had been no time, even if there had been the desire. He had thought that there would be some scattered groups of survivors, but he hadn't found any. The war had been too thorough. Landing on the Earth should have killed him, for the air itself was poisoned. He hadn't cared, and he had lived. He seemed to be immune to the various kinds of germs and radiations, or perhaps that was part of his new power. He certainly had encountered enough of both, skipping around the world in his ship, from the ruins of one city to another, across blasted valleys and plains, scorched mountains. He had found no life. But he did discover something. He could create. He realized the power on his third day on Earth. Wistfully, he had wished for a tree in the midst of the melted rock and metal. A tree had appeared. The rest of the day he experimented and found that he could create anything that he had ever seen or heard about. Things he knew best, he could create best. Things he knew just from books or conversation, palaces, for example, tended to be lopsided and uncertain, although he could make them nearly perfect by laboring mentally over the details. Everything he created was three-dimensional. Even the food tasted like food and seemed to nourish him. He could forget all about one of his creations, go to sleep, and it would still be there when he awakened. He could also uncreate. A single concentrated thought and the thing he had made would vanish. The larger the thing, the longer it would take to uncreate. Things he hadn't made, valleys and mountains, he could uncreate too, but it took longer. It seemed as though matter was easier to handle once he had shaped it. He could make birds and small animals, or things that looked like birds and small animals. He had never tried to make a human being. He wasn't a scientist, he had been a space pilot. He had a vague concept of atomic theory and practically no idea of genetics. He thought that some change must have taken place in his germ plasma, or in his brain, or perhaps in the earth. The why of it all didn't especially bother him. It was a fact, and he accepted it. He stared at the monument again. Something about it bothered him. Of course, he could have created it, but he didn't know if the things he made would endure after his death. They seemed stable enough, but they might dissolve with his own dissolution. Therefore, he compromised. He created a chisel and mallet, but selected a granite wall that he hadn't made. He cut the letters into the inside of the wall of the cave, so that they would be safe from the elements, working many hours at a stretch, sleeping and eating beside the wall. From the mouth of the cave he could see his ship, perched on a level plain of scorched ground. He was in no hurry to get back to it. In 6 days the inscription was done, cut deeply and eternally into the rock. The thought that had been bothering him as he stared at the gray granite finally came to the surface. The only people who would come to read it would be visitors from the stars. How would they decipher it? He stared at the inscription angrily. He should have written it in symbols. But what kind of symbols? Mathematics, of course, but what would that tell them about man? And what made him think they would discover the cave anyway? There was no use for an inscription when man's entire history was written over the face of the planet, scorched into the crust for anyone to see. He cursed his stupidity for wasting 6 days working on a useless inscription. He was about to uncreate it when he turned his head, hearing footsteps at the mouth of the cave. He almost fell off the chair getting to his feet. A girl was standing there. He blinked rapidly. She was still there. A dark-haired girl dressed in a torn, dirty, one-piece overall. "Hi," she said, and walked into the cave. "I heard you hammering from the valley." Automatically, he offered her his chair and created another for himself. She tested it gingerly before she sat down. "I saw you do it," she said, "but I still don't believe it. Mirrors?" "No," he muttered uncertainly. "I create. That is, I have the power to... Wait a minute. How did you get here?" While he was demanding to know, he considered and rejected possibilities. Hidden in a cave? On a mountaintop? No, there would only be one possible way. "I was in your ship, pal." She leaned back on the chair and clasped her hands around one knee. "When you loaded up that cruiser, I figured you were going to beat it. I was getting tired of setting fuses 18 hours a day, so I stowed away. Anybody else alive?" "No. Why didn't I see you then?" He stared at the ragged, beautiful girl, and a vague thought crossed his mind. He reached out and touched her arm. She didn't draw back, but her pretty face grew annoyed. "I'm real," she said bluntly. "You must have seen me at the base. Remember?" He tried to think back to a time when there had been a base. Centuries ago, it seemed. There had been a dark-haired girl there, one who had never given him a tumble. "I think I froze to death," she said, "or into coma anyhow, a few hours after your ship took off. Lousy heating system you have in that crate," she shivered reminiscently. "Would have used up too much oxygen," he explained. "Just kept the pilot's compartment heated and aired. Used a suit to drag supplies forward when I needed them." "I'm glad you didn't see me," she laughed. "I must have looked like the devil, all covered with frost and killed, I bet. Some sleeping beauty I probably made. Well, I froze. When you opened all the compartments, I revived. That's the whole story. Guess it took a few days. How come you didn't see me?" "I suppose I never looked back there," he admitted. "Quick enough, I found out I didn't need supplies. Funny, I thought I opened all the compartments, but I don't really remember." She looked at the inscription on the wall. "What's that?" "I thought I'd leave some sort of monument." "Who's going to read it?" she said practically. "No one, probably. It's just a foolish idea." He concentrated on it. In a few moments, the granite wall was bare. "I still don't understand how you could be alive now," he said, puzzled. "But I am. I don't see how you do that." She gestured at the chair and the wall. "But I'll accept the fact that you can. Why don't you accept the fact that I'm alive?" "Don't get me wrong," the man said. "I want company very much, especially female company. It's just... turn your back." She complied with a questioning look. Quickly, he destroyed the stubble on his face and created a clean pair of pressed pants and a shirt. Stepping out of his tattered uniform, he put on the new clothes, destroying the rags and, on an afterthought, created a comb and straight disentangled brown hair. "All right," he said, "you can turn back now." "Not bad," she smiled, looking him over. "Let me use that comb, and would you please make me a dress, size 12, but see that the weight goes in the right places." On the third attempt, he had the thing right. He had never realized how deceptive the shapes of women can be. And then he made a pair of gold sandals with high heels for her. "A little tight," she said, putting them on, "and not too practical without sidewalks. But thanks much. This trick of yours really solves the Christmas present problem, doesn't it?" Her dark hair was shining in the noon sun, and she looked very lovely and warm and human. "See if you can create," he urged, anxious to share his startling new ability with her. "I already tried," she said. "No go. Still a man's world." He frowned. "How can I be absolutely sure you're real?" "That again? Do you remember creating me, master?" she said mockingly, bending to loosen the strap on one shoe. "I had been thinking about women," he said grimly. "I might have created you while I was asleep. Why shouldn't my subconscious mind have as much power as my conscious mind? I would have equipped you with a memory, given you a background. You would have been extremely plausible. And if my subconscious mind did create you, then it would make certain that my conscious mind would never know." "You're ridiculous." "Because if my conscious mind knew," he went on relentlessly, "it would reject your existence. Your entire function as a creation of my subconscious would be to keep me from knowing, to prove by any means in your power, by any logic, that you were—" "Let's see you create a woman, then, if your mind is so good." She crossed her arms and leaned back in the chair, giving a single sharp nod. "All right." He stared at the cave wall, and a woman started to appear. It took shape sloppily. One arm too short, legs too long. Concentrating harder, he was able to make its proportions fairly true. But its eyes were set at odd angles. Its shoulders and back were sloped and twisted. He had created a shell without brains or internal organs. An automaton. He commanded it to speak, but only gulps came out of its shapeless mouth. He hadn't given it any vocal apparatus. Shuddering, he destroyed the nightmare figure. "I'm not a sculptor," he said, "nor am I God." "I'm glad you finally realized that." "That still doesn't prove," he continued stubbornly, "that you're real. I don't know what my subconscious mind is capable of." Make something for me, she said abruptly. I'm tired of listening to this nonsense. I've hurt her feelings, he thought. The only other human on Earth, and I've hurt her. He nodded, took her by the hand, and led her out of the cave. On a flat plain below, he created a city. He had experimented with it a few days back, and it was much easier this time. Patterned after pictures and childhood dreams of the 1001 Nights, it towered black and white and rose. The walls gleamed ruby, and the gates were silver-stained ebony. The towers were red gold, and sapphires glittered in them. A great staircase of milky ivory climbed to the highest opal spire, set with thousands of steps of veined marble. There were lagoons of blue water, and little birds fluttered about them, and silver and gold fish darted through the still depths. They walked through the city, and he created a rose for her, white and yellow and red, and gardens of strange blooms. Between the two domed and spired buildings he created a vast pool of water. On it he put a purple canopied pleasure barge, loaded with every kind of food and drink he could remember. They floated across the lagoon, fanned by a soft breeze he had created. And all this is false, he reminded her after a little while. She smiled. No, it's not. You can touch it. It's real. Will it be here after I die? Who cares? Besides, if you can do all this, you can cure any sickness. Perhaps you can even cure old age and death. She plucked a blossom from an overhanging bough and sniffed its fragrance. You could keep this from fading and dying. You could probably do the same for us. So what's the problem? Would you like to go away? He said, puffing on a newly created cigarette. Would you like to find a new planet, untouched by war? Would you like to start over? Start over? You mean later, perhaps. Now I don't even want to go near the ship. It reminds me of the war. They floated on a little way. Are you sure now that I'm real? She asked. If you want me to be honest, no, he replied. But I want very much to believe it. Then listen to me, she said, leaning toward him. I'm real. She slipped her arm around his neck. I've always been real. I always will be real. You want proof? Well, I know I'm real. So do you. What more can you ask? He stared at her for a long time, felt her warm arms around his neck, listened to her breathing. He could smell the fragrance of her skin and hair, the unique essence of an individual. Shortly he said, I believe you. I love you. What is your name? She thought for a moment. Joan. Strange, he said. I've always dreamed of a girl named Joan. What's your last name? She kissed him. Overhead, the swallows he had created, his swallows, wheeled in wide circles above the lagoon. His fish darted aimlessly to and fro, and his city stretched, proud and beautiful, to the edge of the twisted lava mountains. You didn't tell me your last name, he said. Oh, that! A girl's maiden name never matters. She always takes her husband's. That's an evasion. She smiled. It is, isn't it? End of Proof of the Pudding by Robert Sheckley. The Rag and Bone Men by August Budrys. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Unfortunate castaway, marooned far from home, with nothing to share his loneliness but humans. The Rag and Bone Men by August Budrys. The other one, Carpentier, he called himself. He and I were going up the hill to the foundation, carrying our bags, when I happened to remark that I didn't think the veldt was sane anymore. I call myself Maurer. Carpentier said nothing for a moment. We kept walking up the gravel path between the unimaginatively clipped hedges. But he was frowning a little, and after a while he said in an absent way, Now, How would one determine that? He looked straight into my eyes, which is something that has always upset me, and challenged. I don't think one could. I felt the shock of inadequacy. Words came out of me, perfectly accurate words, I know, but I never know how, and sometimes, when asked, I forget. Now I must be very lucid. I must be his kind of man, I thought, and pick my way among my words. These things he's got us get, I said, putting the burlap bag down and stopping so as to hold Charpentier in one place. He wants to build something unearthly, Charpentier said, annoyed because I was playing his kind of trick on him, and so baldly. What standard do you propose to judge by? But I was right and he was wrong. Now it remained to make him see how. Yes, he wants to build something unearthly, out of earthly parts. He wants to take 6 radio tubes from an earthly radio, 3 pieces of earthly lucite, exactly 1/4 earthly inch thick, a roll of earthly 16-gauge wire, a General Electric heat lamp, and all these other things, the polystyrene foam blocks, the polyurethane plastic sheeting, polyvinyl insulated tape. What have you in your bag, Charpentier? Out of all this, he wants to make a Veldish thing. He spent years learning about earthly things, Charpentier pointed out. 4 years we brought him books, men, everything he needs. Now he's learned what the earthly equivalents of Veldish materials are, and he's ready to make his new transporter. Charpentier had a dark face, dark hair, dark beard, dark eyes. When his dark brows drew together, it was easy to see that his best expression was dark scorn. I think he's desperate, I said. I think he's learned all he can. He's learned what the nearest earthly equivalents to Veldish things are. And he's learned that all Earth can give him nothing closer. I don't see how he can do better, even he. You cannot make apples of cabbages. But he wants to get home. You know he wants so much to leave here and get home. And now he's desperate, and is going to try to make a new transporter out of materials nothing like those in the one that broke and marooned him here. And it won't function? Charpentier asked. There is that risk, but why shouldn't he try? What's insane in that? I fear it might work. I fear it might work in ways a transporter should not. And I shivered, for if I say something, I feel it, and I do not feel anything I don't believe is right. I have been wrong, but not often. Or perhaps I forget. Charpentier smiled. How should a Veld transporter work? That's not the point, I cried at Charpentier's obstinacy at being Charpentier. I don't have to know. The Veld has to know, and to be insane enough to try something different. Look, I said, searching, being my own kind of man now, and letting the words come straight from the images in my head. Assume a man. Assume a man stranded on an island for years. Assume he has ways of realizing his heart's desire, if only he can find the things to work with. But it's a small island, and while it's a good island, how can it give a marooned man not only comfort, but heart's desire? He searches. Perhaps he sends messengers, if he himself cannot penetrate the jungle, such messengers as he can command. And in the end, after years, he knows he cannot have exactly what he wants. But he'd have something very near it. So in the end, he takes a rag, a bone, and a hank of hair. And makes a woman, Charpentier laughed. If he fails, what of it? But if he succeeds, Charpentier, if he succeeds, couldn't he see? What sort of woman? Charpentier looked at me for a moment, but I hadn't made him see. He saw only me, and I had taken up his time without delivering value, so he chastened me. The Veld made me and you. Are you dissatisfied? He had that trick, Charpentier. If you tried to give him a problem he couldn't solve, he gave you a greater problem of your own, to add to the one you already carried. I picked up my bag and followed him up the hill to the foundation, where the Veld timelessly waited. It was dusk. and as I walked, I turned my eyes up to the stars. One eye was larger than the other, and a different color. My nose sat askew on my lumpen face. Though Charpentier was a hunchback and lacked a finger, still he was a handsome hunchback. But I, whom the Veld had made second, with Charpentier's example, was merely whole. And from my eyes, tears. We entered the foundation. It had been erected around the Veld when he first came, and there were men who could question. Now the building was neat and kept up, but all its many rooms were empty, and all its many machines were still. Charpentier had his cottage on the west. A very learned man had used it while working with the Veld. And I had mine on the east, where the military commander had kept his family. The Veld lived in the heart of the foundation, in an odd-shaped room whose walls traced the configuration he had been forced to assume when his broken transporter had interrupted his journey between where? And the home he pined for. Men came from the town below the hill to care for the building, but Charpentier or I had to go fetch them. They no longer questioned. They distressed us with their constant need for commanding, and so every time they were finished with their work, we commanded them homeward. No earthly creature lived on the hill. The Veld was kind, but an end comes to kindness. The time came when the questioning of men would have led them, if answered, irrevocably into Veldish ways. It was perhaps a kindness, too, that the Veld did what he did to questioning creatures. But however it may have been, now there were only men to be commanded. Charpentier commanded in the west, and I in the east, and the Veld, though he permitted us to question all men and each other, commanded us. Charpentier and I did not often speak to each other while on the foundation. We were too near the Veld and insufficiently full of ourselves. But as we rode down in the elevator with its noise of metal sliding all alone in the world, Charpentier looked at me, and I knew what he looked. I have thought to myself that Charpentier says of everything, "Why is this thing not perfect?" While I say to myself, "Where is the perfection in this thing?" Surely my thought is as potent as his. But you see his advantage over me, for he is forever safe from what I might look at him. But I was not safe. We reached the chamber of the Veld. We opened the door and displayed our accumulation to his perceptions. "My being reflects you," the Veld told us from his perception, and seeing that he was become beautiful, I knew we had done well. "Now will I make and take my way, and you in your sorrow stay to see the world restored." This was what he had promised the world and us before he put an end to questioning, though only we remembered. But I wondered. I did not question. I wondered, as I imagined his making of the new transporter, taking my imagined thing from what I knew of how he made us. I wondered whether the world was safe. I thought of the chamber beside this one, where we had been born. I had often been there, only to look. There is a tank, the Rochester, Minnesota Biophysical Equipment Company tank. And there is a Velikaya Socialistkaya Rosinya coagulator, and the IBM 704, and the Braun Bolivari heater. There stand the cabinets, with their Torsen-held Artsimetal refrigerator units, and the cabinets full of flasks and ampules. And there is an autoclave full of Becton, Dixon, Yale syringes, and dangling from the wall are the Waldos that the Veld used to manipulate all of these things. And of all of these earthly things, the Veld made men not entirely earthly, but the Veld is a Veld. Now soon the new transporter would take the Veld away, in ways I wondered were perilous, and it would be Charpentier and I who stayed to see the world restored. Charpentier and I, who called ourselves, but had no names. He commanded us to go, and we went. I east, Charpentier west. I saw Charpentier hurry down his side of the hill, handsome and hasty under the stars. I walked, For me to run is a risk, and I trembled. For me to feel is to know, and the Veld was desperate. He slept at night, secure from questions even though he slept, for his power, once exercised, was irrevocable so long as he existed. But tonight he did not sleep. He made. I thought of my assumed man, on his assumed island, red-eyed and tremulous of hand, bent over his pot, stirring, unable to wait for morning. I thought of the light from his fire, shining in the dumb eyes of his faithful messengers, waiting on the edge of his clearing. The messengers are dismissed from service, yet not quite sure they are dismissed. And I thought of this earth, and the Veld's old promise to us that tomorrow it would wake, knuckling its eyes, and need a loving voice to say there was an end to nightmares. I would speak, Charpentier would speak, but what would we say? And in what voices, born of the Veld's touch on the Waldos? And would there be more than speaking to do? I did not think there was much I could do but speak. Charpentier lacks a finger, but I have hands, but I lack them. Oh, but the stars were cold. The moon in this season is a day moon, and now below the horizon. Stars, stars and galaxies, but beyond them, where the Veldish beings live, nothing I could see. And below the stars too, here where I reached the brow of the hill and clumsily opened my wings, here too nothing, as I lurched into the night, and in great strain beat toward the places of men. I had a favorite place, a place I had chosen to begin to speak from. It was small, as men measure things. A few lights in the darkness. Here the sheen of the lake, there the tiered woolliness of trees. A town in which I disposed those men who must first unbind themselves from years of no questioning. For unlike the Veld and his transporter, and even the Veld needed a transporter, Charpentier and I could not be everywhere. It was my thought to reassure these men first, and have them go out and reassure others, as older brothers will soothe the younger in the night. I knew from an old argument that Charpentier planned the same, but of course they would not be the same sort of men for Charpentier as for me. Still, they were all men. Once they had all rubbed the sleep from their eyes, they would tell each other what they saw, and in the end, all men would have to agree on the shape of the world. So it would not matter what imperfections Charpentier pointed out, or what implicit glories I perceived, if the Veld's hands did not tremble as he stirred his pot. And yet it had. Charpentier had said more than he thought when he had thought to stop my mouth with myself. I faced away from the foundation, now mile on mile behind me, but my eyes turned inward, and in me my mind hovered over the Veld. I had no actual distant eye, no way of seeing beyond the curve of the world, or through the haze of the air, no ear to hear a sound so far away that it cannot urge the molecules of air my pinions grope at. But often it was well enough to think, for any thought seems accurate enough to act on, and in time thoughts grow so practiced that they might as well be eyes. And so I saw the Veld, though I did not see him, and I saw him falter. In me the Veld suddenly told, I have made, and I go. Forgive me for your sorrow. And I forgave him as I had forgiven him long ago, for his duty was to men, not to ourselves who are part of the duty. And Charpentier, I knew, had nothing to forgive, for he was glad of his sorrow. Wind numbed my eyes. I wept. Under the cold stars, my crude cheeks glistened. I hovered over the town, where some men slept, and some men worked, because some machines ran during the day and some ran at night. And I listened for anything else the Veld might have to tell, for he was my irrevocable commander as long as he existed on this earth. I also listened with the ear of habitated thought, and I heard. In my mind's eye, I saw the Veld use the earthly transporter, but it was not with my mind's ear alone that I heard what I heard. The pot erupts, The stranded man claws back in agony so great he cannot even scream, arms, legs, and face smoldering, and jounces on the ground, to lie, to moan, to be a long, mindless time dying. And at the clearing's edge the little messengers have no one to say what could be done to soothe him. What now? Where to go? What to do? How to repair? Oh, Veld, Veld, long-living Veld, what truly eternal sorrow! I sank down through the air, bereft and graceless. What could I do for the Veld? All that remained for me was what I could say to men, but I knew as I landed among them that the Veld's promise could not be kept, since the Veld was still here. I cried out to the men, "Awake! Arise!" They stumbled out of their houses, but when I said to the first of them, "Question me," he obediently answered, "How?" I go back to where the foundation was now and then. I bring doctors with me. After each time it seems to me that I have found a way to tell them what to seek. The Veld lies where his chamber was, before the stone decayed, and tells me nothing. If he truly reflects me, as he is now, then I don't know if I can bear to wait for the day when I can dash myself down from the outraged air and surrender myself to the sea-speckled rocks. The doctors say that if only someone would tell them what questions to ask about the Veld, and if only someone would give them the answers to the questions, they might be able to do something. Charpentier is there sometimes and mocks me. "You're getting crazier every day, Maurer," he says. "Suppose you restore the Veld. Then what? Does he make another transporter?" He shakes his head. "Poor Maurer, what are you going to do to these people you bring here? What do you want from them? Something the Veld himself couldn't accomplish?" I try to tell them how to question, and I command them to question, and I hope the Veld dies. But though Charpentier and I, even Charpentier and I, are growing a little older, the Veld is still moribund, and no more dead than he was before the days when 30 generations of men battled to keep the southmost edge of the creeping ice from burying the Veld beyond the reach of hope. For I hope, though I can see a sprig of silver here and there in Charpentier's darkness now. The Veld must be accessible to my hope, though I must command millions of men. And I think Charpentier hopes too, because so long as he can see me failing, he knows I am imperfect, but he wishes perfection for me. I know he brings no doctors only because he has not yet found a way for men to respond to the command, "Be perfect." Every time the hope dies, I tell my men, "Go home now, rest." And they go home. But I blunder about thinking that perhaps if I could kill the Veld, that would be the end of it. But nothing can kill the Veld, unless it be something the Veld knows of. So first we must heal the Veld. And healed, he will once again seek his heart's desire, hopelessly. As do I. As do I. End of The Rag and Bone Men by Algris Budrus.
The Semantic War by Bill Clothier. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Semantic War by Bill Clothier. Perhaps there have been causes for slaughter just as silly as this was, but try to find one. The rain pours down, chill, out of a sullen sky. My pace quickens as I try to regain the relative warmth and shelter of the cavern before it become thoroughly drenched. I cannot afford to catch a cold. All alone as I am, and with no medicine, I would stand too great a chance of a quick death. These lowering Oregon skies still hold traces of nameless disease in their writhing cloud tendrils. I am not just afraid of a cold. That would only be the key for some other malady to use and strike me down forever. I see the cave up ahead and feel a sense of contentment as I draw near and then duck inside its stony mouth. The rain hisses without, but inside it is dry. There is a heavy cowhide hanging on a peg in the wall, and I take it down and wrap it around me. Soon I will be warm. Once more I may stave off my ultimate end. Sometimes I wonder why I wish to put it off. Certainly, according to my old standards, there is no point in living. But somehow I feel that the mere fact of living is justification in itself, even for such a life as mine. I didn't always feel this way, but then my circumstances change and people change with them. I changed my circumstances more than myself, but I had no alternative. So now I exist. I suppose I should be content. After all, I am alive, and in my own simple way, I enjoy life. I can remember people who asked nothing more than to be allowed to live, to exist. Ironically enough, I always considered them subnormal. I felt that a man should strive to do something that would not only perpetuate the happiness of his own life, but that of his fellow men. Something that would make life more beautiful and easier and more kind. It was with this feeling that I applied myself as a student of philosophy at Stanford University. And the strengthening of this same belief led me to take up teaching and embrace it as the only way of obtaining genuine happiness. My personal philosophy was simple. I would learn about life in all its real and symbolic meanings, and then teach it to my pupils, each of whom, I felt sure, were thirsting for the knowledge that I was extracting from my cultural environment. I would show them the meaning behind things. That, I felt, was the key to successful living. Now, it seems strangely pathetic that I should have essayed such an impossible task, but even a professor of philosophy can be mistaken and become confused. I remember when I first became aware of the movement. For years we had been drilling certain precepts into the soft, impressionable heads of those students who came under our influence. Liberalism, some called it, the right to take the values accumulated by society over a period of hundreds of years and bend them to fit whatever idea or act was contemplated. By such methods it was possible to fit the mores to the deed, and not the deed to the mores. Oh, it was a wonderful theory, one that promised to project all human activities entirely beyond good and evil. However, I digress. It was a spring morning at Berkeley, California, when I had my first inkling of the movement. I was sitting in my office, gazing out the window and considering life in my usual contemplative fashion. I might say I was being rather smug. I was thinking how fortunate I was to have been graduated from Stanford with such high honors, and how my good luck had stayed with me until I received my doctor's degree in a famous Eastern university and came out to take an associate professorship at the Berkeley campus. I was watching the hurrying figures below on the crosswalks and idly noting the brilliant green of the shrubbery and the trees and the lawn. I was mixing up Keats with a bit of philosophy and thoroughly enjoying myself. Knowledge is truth, truth beauty, I mused. That is all we know on earth and all we need to know. There was a knock on my door and I said, "Come in," reluctantly abandoning my train of thought, which had just picked up Shakespeare, whom I was going to consider as 2/3 philosopher and 1/3 poet. I have never felt that the field of literature had the sole claim to Shakespeare's greatness. Professor Lilac came in, visibly perturbed. Lilac was a somewhat erratic individual, for a professor at least, and he was often perturbed. Once he became excited about the possibilities of the campus shrubbery being stunted and discolored by the actions of certain dogs living on campus. He was not a philosophy professor, of course, but a member of the political science group. "Carlson?" he asked nervously. "Have you heard about it yet?" "I have no idea," I returned good-naturedly. "Heard about what?" He looked behind him as if he thought he might be followed. Then he whirled around, his sharp-featured face alight with feeling. "Carlson, the Wistick Dufels, the Moraddy!" And he stared at me intently, his gimlet eyes almost blazing. I stared back at him blankly. "You haven't heard?" he exclaimed. "I thought surely you would know about it. You're always talking about freedom to apply thought for the good of humanity. Well, we're finally going to do something about it. You'll see. Keep your ears open, Carlson." Then he turned and started out of the room. He paused at the threshold and fixed me again with his ferret-like eyes. "The Wistick Dufels, the Moraddy," he said, and vanished through the door. And that was my first unheeded omen of what was to come. I paid little attention to it. Lillick wasn't the sort of man who inspired attention. As a matter of fact, I considered reporting him to the head of his department as being on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But I didn't. In those days, nervous breakdowns were a common occurrence around college campuses. The educational profession was a very hazardous occupation. One Southern university, for example, reported 5 faculty suicides during spring quarter. In the days that followed, however, I began to realize that there was some sort of movement being fostered by the student body. It couldn't be defined, but it could be felt and seen. The students began to form groups and hold meetings, often without official sanction. What they were about could not be discovered, but some of the results soon became evident. For one thing, certain students began to walk on one side of the street, and the other students walked on the other side. The ones who used the north side of the street wore green sweaters with white trousers or skirts, and the south side students wore white sweaters with green trousers or skirts. It even got to the point where those in green sweaters went only to classes in the morning, and those in white attended the afternoon sessions. Then the little white cards began to appear. They were sent through the mail. They were slipped under doorways and in desk drawers. They turned up beside your plate at dinner and under your pillow at night. They were pasted on your front door in the morning, and they appeared in the flyleaves of your books. They were even hung on trees like fruit, and surely no fruit ever spored so queer a seedling. They said either one thing or the other. The Wistick Dufels, the Moraddy, or the Moraddy Dufels, the Wistick. Which card belonged to what group was not immediately clear. It was not until the riots broke out that the thing began to be seen in its proper perspective, and then it was too late. When the first riot started, it was assumed that the university officials and the police could quell it in a very short time. But strangely enough, as additional police were called in, the battle raged even more fiercely. I could see part of the affair from my window, and therefore was able to understand why the increasing police force only added to the turmoil. They were fighting one another, and through the din could be heard the wild shouts of "The Wistick Dufels the Moraddy," or "The Moraddy Dufels the Wistick." The final blow came when I saw the registrar and the dean of men struggling fiercely in one of the hedgerows, and heard the dean of men yell in wild exultation as he brought a briefcase down on the registrar's head, "The Wistick Dufels the Moraddy." Then someone broke in through the door of my office. I turned in alarm, and saw a huge 3-letter man standing only a few feet from me. He had been in one of my classes. I remembered something about his being the hardest driving fullback on the Pacific coast. He was certainly the dumbest philosophy student I ever flunked. His hair was mussed, and he was wild-eyed. He had blood on his face and chest, and his clothes were torn and grass-stained. "The Wistick dufels the Moraddy," he said. "Get out of my office," I told him coldly, "and stay out." "So you're on the other side," he snarled. "I hoped you would be." He started toward me, and I seized a bookend on my desk and tried to strike him with it. But he brushed it aside and came on in. His first blow nearly broke my arm, and as I dropped my guard due to the numbing pain, he struck me solidly on the side of the jaw. When I recovered consciousness, I was lying by the side of my desk where I had fallen. My head ached and my neck was stiff. I got painfully to my feet and then noticed the big square of cardboard pinned to the door of my office. It was lettered in red pencil and in past tense said, "The Wistick dufelled the Moraddy." The uprisings arose spontaneously in all parts of the country. They were not confined to colleges. They were not confined to any particular group. They encompassed nearly the entire population, and the fervor aroused by their battle cry, whichever one it might be, was beyond all comprehension. I could not understand either slogan's meaning, and there were others like myself. On several occasions I attempted to find out, but I was beaten twice and threatened with a pistol the third time, so I gave up all such efforts. I was never much given to any sort of physical violence. One night I went home, thoroughly disheartened by the state of affairs. The university was hardly functioning. Nearly the entire faculty, including the college president, had been drawn into one camp or the other. Their actions were utterly abhorrent to me. If the professor was a Greentop or a Wistickian, he lectured only to Greentops. If he belonged to the Moraddians or White Top faction, they were the only ones who could enter his classroom. The two groups were so evenly divided that open violence was frowned upon as a means of attaining whatever end they had in view. They were biding their time and gathering strength for fresh onslaughts on each other. As I say, I went home feeling very discouraged. My wife was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and I went in and sat down at the table while she worked. The daily paper was lying on the table, its headlines loaded with stories of bloodshed and strife throughout the nation. I glanced through them. Lately there seemed to be a sort of pattern forming. East of the Mississippi, the general slogan was emerging as "the Moraddy dufelling the Wistick." West of the Mississippi, the Wistick was receiving the greater support, and it seemed that the younger people and the women preferred the Moraddy, while elderly people and most men were on the side of the Wistick. I commented on this. My wife answered briefly, "Of course, anyone should know that the Moraddy will win out." She went on with the preparations for dinner, not looking at me. I sat stunned for a moment. Great God in heaven, not my wife! "Am I to understand that you are taking any part of this seriously?" I asked with some heat. "The whole thing is a horrible, pointless prank." She turned and faced me squarely. "Not to me. I say the Moraddy will win out. I want it to. And I think you'd be wise to get on the bandwagon while there's still time." I realized she was serious, dead serious. I tried a cautious query. "Just what does the dufellation of the Wistick by the Moraddy mean?" And it made her angry. It actually made her angry. She swished off the front burner and walked past me into the living room. I didn't think she was going to answer, but she did, sort of. "There is no excuse for an egghead in your position not knowing what it means." Her voice was strained and tense. "If you had any perception whatever, you would understand what the Moraddy has to give the American people. It's our only hope, and you've got to take sides. You're either for the Moraddy or the Wistick. You can't take the middle way." I felt completely isolated. "Wait, I don't know what it means." "Forget it," she broke in. "I should have known. You were born, you have lived, and you will die an egghead in an ivory tower. Just remember, The Moraddy Dufels, the Wistic. And she swept on upstairs to pack, and out of my life. And that's the way it was. Whatever malignant poison had seeped into the collective brain of the nation, it was certainly a devastating leveler of all sorts of institutions and values. Wives left husbands and husbands left wives. Joint bank accounts vanished. Families disintegrated. Wall Street crumpled. Developments were swift and ominous. The army split up into various groups. Most of the enlisted men favored the Moraddy, but the officers and older non-coms pledged the Wistickian faith. Their power was sufficient to hold many in line, but a considerable number in the lower ranks deserted and joined forces with the Moraddians, who held the eastern half of the country. The Wistics ruled the western half with an iron hand, and all signs pointed toward civil war. Labor and military authorities conscripted the entire population regardless of age, sex, or religious convictions. For my own part, I slipped away from the campus and fled north into the Oregon mountains. It was not that I was afraid to fight, but I rebelled at the absolute stupidity of the whole thing. The idea, fighting because of a few words! But they did. The destruction was frightful. However, it was not as bad as many had thought it would be. The forces of the Wistic leveled the city of New York, true, but it took 3 H-bombs to do the job, instead of 1, as the Air Force had claimed. In retaliation, San Francisco and Los Angeles were destroyed in a single night by cleverly placed atom bombs smuggled in by a number of fifth columnist wives who gained access to the cities under the pretext of returning to their husbands. This was a great victory for the Moraddians, even though the women had to blow themselves up to accomplish their mission. The Moraddian forces were slowly beaten back toward the Atlantic shores. They were very cunning fighters, and they had youthful courage to implement that cunning. But their overall policy lacked the stability and long-range thinking necessary to the prosecution of total war. One day they might overrun many populous areas, and the next day, due to the constant bickering and quarreling among their own armies, they would lose all they had won, and more too. Finally, in desperation, they loosed their most horrible weapon, germ warfare. But they forgot to protect themselves against their own malignity. The Semantic War ground to a shuddering halt. The carrion smell of death lay round the world. The dufellation of the Wistic and the Moraddy. So here I am, scuttling around in the forests like a lonely pack rat. It is not the sort of life I would choose if there were any other choice. Yet life has become very simple. I enjoy the simple things, and I enjoy them with gusto. When I find food that suits my stomach, I am happy. When I quench my thirst, I am happy. When I see a beautiful sunset from one of my mountain crags, I am happy. It takes little when you have little, and there have been few men who have had less. Only one thing troubles me. I suppose it doesn't matter, but I go on wondering. I wonder which side was right. I mean, really right. End of The Semantic War by Bill Clothier.
Teething Ring by James Causey. Anyone can make an error, but the higher the society, the more disastrous the mistake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. Teething Ring by James Causey. Half an hour before, while she had been engrossed in the current soap opera, and Harry Jr. was screaming in his crib, Melinda would naturally have slammed the front door in the little man's face. However, when the bell rang, she was wearing her new Chinese red housecoat, had just lustered her nails to a blinding scarlet, and Harry Jr. was sleeping like an angel. Yawning, Melinda answered the door, and the little man said, beaming, "Excellent day! I have gewgaws for information." Melinda did not quite recoil. He was perhaps 5 feet tall, with a gleaming, hairless scalp and a young, old face. He wore a plain gray tunic, and a peddler's tray hung from his thin shoulders. "Don't want any," Melinda said flatly. "Please." He had great, beseeching amber eyes. "They all say that. I haven't much time. I must be back to the university by noon." "You're working your way through college?" He brightened. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Alien anthropology major." Melinda softened. The initiation those frats pulled nowadays, shaving the poor guy's head, eating goldfish, it was criminal. "Well," she said grudgingly, "what's in the tray?" "Langlers," said the little man eagerly. "Oscilloscopes, portable force field generators, a neural distorter." Melinda's face was blank. The little man frowned. "You use them, of course. This is a Class 4 culture." Melinda essayed a weak shrug, and the little man sighed with relief. His eyes fled past her to the blank screen of the TV set. "Ah, a monitor," he said, smiling. "For a moment I was afraid. May I come in?" Melinda shrugged, opened the door. This might be interesting, like a vacuum cleaner salesman who had cleaned her drapes last week for free. And Kitty Kyle Battle's life wouldn't be on for almost an hour. "My name is Porteous," said the little man with an eager smile. "I'm doing a thematic on Class 4 cultures." He whipped out a stylus, began jotting down notes. The TV set fascinated him. "It's turned off right now," Melinda said. Porteous' eyes widened impossibly. "You mean," he whispered in horror, "that you're exercising Class 5 privileges? This is terribly confusing. I get doors slammed in my face when Class 4s are supposed to have a splendid gregarian quotient. You do have atomic power, don't you?" "Oh, sure," said Melinda uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be much fun. "Space travel?" The little face was intent, sharp. "Well," Melinda yawned, looking at the blank screen, "they've got Space Patrol, Space Cadet, Tales of Tomorrow." "Excellent. Rocket ships or force fields?" Melinda blinked. "Does your husband own one?" Melinda shook her blonde head helplessly. "What are your economic circumstances?" Melinda took a deep, rasping breath and said, "Listen, mister, is this a demonstration or a quiz program?" "Oh, my excuse. Demonstration, certainly. You will not mind the questions?" "Questions?" There was an ominous glint in Melinda's blue eyes. "Your delightful primitive customs, art forms, personal habits." "Look," said Melinda crimsonly, "this is a respectable neighborhood, and I'm not answering any Kinsey report. Understand?" The little man nodded, scribbled. "Personal habits are taboo. I so regret. The demonstration." He waved grandly at the tray. "Anti-grav sandals, a portable solar converter. Apologizing for this miserable selection, but on Capella they told me—" He followed Melinda's entranced gaze, selected a tiny green vial. "This is merely a regenerative solution. You appear to have no cuts or bruises." "Oh," said Melinda nastily, "cures warts, cancer, grows hair, I suppose." Porteous brightened. "Of course. I can see you scan. Amazing." He scribbled further with his stylus, glancing up, blinking at the obvious scorn on Melinda's face. "Here, try it." "You try it." Now watch him squirm. Porteous hesitated. "Would you like me to grow an extra finger? Hair?" "Grow some hair." Melinda tried not to smile. The little man unstopped the vial, poured a shimmering drop on his wrist, frowning. "Must concentrate," he said. "Thorium-based suspended solution. Really jolts the endocrines. Complete control. See?" Melinda's jaw dropped. She stared at the tiny tuft of hair which had sprouted on the bare wrist. She was thinking abruptly, unhappily, about the chignon she had bought yesterday. They had let her buy that for $8, when with this stuff she could have a natural one. "How much?" she inquired cautiously. "Half an hour of your time only," said Porteous. Melinda grasped the vial firmly, settled down on the sofa with one leg tucked carefully underneath her. "Okay, shoot, but nothing personal." Porteous was delighted. He asked a multitude of questions, most of them pointless, some naive, and Melinda dug into her infinitesimal fund of knowledge and gave. The little man scribbled furiously, clucking like a gravid hen. "You mean," he asked in amazement, "that you live in these primitive huts of your own volition?" "It's a GI housing project," Melinda said, ashamed. "Astonishing." He wrote feudal anachronisms and atomic power side by side. Class 4s periodically rough it in back-to-nature movements. Harry Jr. chose that moment to begin screaming for his lunch. Porteous sat trembling. "Is that a security alarm?" "My son," said Melinda despondently, and went to the nursery. Porteous followed, and watched the ululating child with some trepidation. "Newborn?" 18 months, said Melinda stiffly, changing diapers. "He's cutting teeth." Porteous shuddered. "What a pity! Obviously atavistic. Wouldn't the creche accept him? You shouldn't have to keep him here." "I keep after Harry to get a maid, but he says we can't afford one." "Manifest insecurity," muttered the little man, studying Harry Jr. "Definite paranoid tendencies." "He's 2 weeks premature," volunteered Melinda. "He's really sensitive." "I know just the thing," Porteous said happily. "Here." He dipped into the glittering litter on the tray and handed Harry Jr. a translucent prism. "A neural distorter. We use it to train regressives on Rigel 2. It may be of assistance." Melinda eyed the thing doubtfully. Harry Jr. was peering into the shifting crystal depths with a somewhat strained expression. "Speeds up the neural flow," explained the little man proudly. "Helps tap the unused 80%. The pre-symptomatic memory is unaffected due to automatic cerebral lapse in case of overload. I'm afraid it won't do much more than cube his present IQ. An intelligent idiot is still an idiot, but—" "How dare you!" Melinda's eyes flashed. "My son is not an idiot. You get out of here this minute and take your things with you." She reached for the prism. Harry Jr. squalled. Melinda relented. "Here," she said angrily, fumbling with her purse. "How much are they?" "Medium of exchange?" Porteous rubbed his bald skull. "Oh, I really shouldn't. But it'll make a wonderful addendum to the chapter on malignant primitives. What is your smallest denomination? Is $1 okay?" Melinda was hopeful. Porteous was pleased with the picture of George Washington. He turned the bill over and over in his fingers and at last bowed low and formally apologized for any taboo violations, and left via the front door. "Crazy fraternities," mumbled Melinda, turning on the TV set. Kitty Kyle was dull that morning. At length Melinda used some of the liquid in the green vial on her eyelashes, and was quite pleased with the results, and hid the rest in the medicine cabinet. Harry Jr. was a model of docility the rest of the day. While Melinda watched TV and munched chocolates, did and redid her hair, Harry Jr. played quietly with the crystal prism. Toward late afternoon, he crawled over to the bookcase, wrestled down an encyclopedia, and pawed through it, gurgling with delight. He definitely, Melinda decided, would make a fine lawyer someday, not a useless putterer like Big Harry, who worked all hours overtime in that damned lab. She scowled as Harry Jr., bored with the encyclopedia, began reaching for one of Big Harry's tomes on nuclear physics. One putterer in the family was enough, but when she tried to take the book away from him, Harry Jr. howled so violently that she left well enough alone. At 6:30, Big Harry called from the lab with the usual despondent message that he would not be home for supper. Melinda said a few resigned things about cheerless dinners eaten alone, hinted darkly at what lonesome wives sometimes did for company, and Harry said he was very sorry, but this might be it, and Melinda hung up on him in a temper. Precisely 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Melinda opened the front door and gaped. This little man could have been Proteus double, except for the black metallic tunic and the glacial gray eyes. "Miss Melinda Adams?" Even the voice was frigid. Yes? Why?" "Major Nord, Galactic Security." The little man bowed. "You were visited earlier this morning by one Porteous." He spoke the name with a certain disgust. "He left a neural distorter here, correct?" Melinda's nod was tremulous. Major Nord came quietly into the living room, shut the door behind him. "My apologies, madam, for the intrusion. Porteous mistook your world for a Class 4 culture instead of a Class 9. Here." He handed her the crumpled dollar bill. "You may check the serial number. The distorter, please." Melinda shrunk limply into the sofa. "I don't understand," she said painfully. "Was he a thief?" "He was careless about his spatial coordinates." Major Nord's teeth showed in the faintest of smiles. "He's been corrected. Where is it?" "Now look," said Melinda with some asperity. "That thing's kept Harry Jr. quiet all day. I bought it in good faith, and it's not my fault. Say, have you got a warrant?" "Madam," said the Major with dignity, "I dislike violating local taboos, but must I explain the impact of a neural distorter on a backwater culture? What if your Neanderthal had been given an atomic blaster? Where would you have been today? Swinging through trees, no doubt. What if your Hitler had force fields?" He exhaled. "Where is your son?" In the nursery, Harry Jr. was contentedly playing with his blocks. The prism lay glinting in the corner. Major Nord picked it up carefully, scrutinized Harry Jr. His voice was very soft. "You say he was playing with it?" Some vestigial maternal instinct prompted Melinda to shake her head vigorously. The little man stared hard at Harry Jr., who began whimpering. Trembling, Melinda scooped up Harry Jr. "Is that all you have to do? Run around frightening women and children? Take your old distorter and get out. Leave decent people alone." Major Nord frowned. If only he could be sure. He peered stonily at Harry Jr., muttered, "Definite egomania, but doesn't seem to have affected him. Strange." "Do you want me to scream?" Melinda demanded. Major Nord sighed. He bowed to Melinda, went out, closed the door, touched a tiny stud on his tunic, and vanished. "The manners of some people," Melinda said to Harry Jr. She was relieved that the Major had not asked for the green vial. Harry Jr. also looked relieved, although for quite a different reason. Big Harry arrived home a little after 11. There were small worry creases about his mouth and forehead, and a leaden cast of defeat in his eyes. He went into the bedroom, and Melinda sleepily told him about the little man working his way through college by peddling silly goods, and about the rude cop named Nord. And Harry said it was simply astonishing. And Melinda said, "Harry, you had a drink." "I had 2 drinks," Harry told her owlishly. "You married a failure, dear. Part of the experimental model vaporized. Whoosh! Just like that. On paper, it looked so good." Melinda had heard it all before. She asked him to see if Harry Jr. was covered, and Big Harry went unsteadily into the nursery, sat down by his son's crib. "Poor little guy," he mused. "Your old man's a bum, a useless tinkerer. He thought he could send a man to the stars on a string of helium nuclei. Oh, he was smart, thought of everything. Auxiliary jets to kick off the negative charge, bigger mercury vapor banks, a fine straight thrust of positive alpha particles." He hiccuped. but his face was in his hands. Didn't you ever stop to think that a few air molecules would defocus the stream? Try a vacuum, stupid. Big Harry stood up. Did you say something, son? Griffle, said Harry Jr. Big Harry reeled into the living room like a somnambulist. He got a pencil and paper, began jotting frantic formulae. Presently he called a cab and raced back to the laboratory. Melinda was dreaming about little bald men with diamond-studded trays. They were chasing her. They kept pelting her with rubies and emeralds. All they wanted was to ask questions, but she kept running, Harry Jr. clasped tightly in her arms. Now they were ringing alarm bells. The bells kept ringing, and she groaned, sat up in bed, and seized the telephone. Darling, Big Harry's voice shook, I've got it. More auxiliary shielding plus a vacuum. We'll be rich. That's fine, said Melinda crossly. You woke the baby. Harry Jr. was sobbing bitterly into his pillow. He was sick with disappointment. Even the most favorable extrapolation showed it would take him 19 years to become master of the world. An eternity. 19 years. The end of Teething Ring by James Causey. With a Vengeance by J.B. Woodley. Keep this in mind in teaching apprentices. They are future journeymen and even masters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothmann. With a Vengeance by J.B. Woodley. October 10th, 2119, New San Francisco. Today at precisely 9:50 a.m., Kyle became first Imperator of Terra. His coup was so fantastically direct and facile that I am almost tempted to believe the old cliché, the time was right. Well, however badly it can be expressed, I suppose the world was ripe for this sort of thing. I can remember when much the same used to happen in elections. One man would win over another by a tremendous majority, and historians would then set about to show how the time was right. Why do I persist in tormenting myself with that phrase? Analytically, I might say I resent the new aristocracy of politics. Specifically, I might say I resent Kyle. And both are true. Both are true. This swing, though, to absolute monarchy, complete with the installation of the Kyle dynasty, damn him, this is something psychologists, not historians, must explain. Has the age of the common man, so bravely flaunted for over 100 years, truly come to nothing? Would people really prefer a figurehead and a symbol of undisputed authority? In this instance, one may again conclude that the time was right. Contact with the planets like Mars and Venus undoubtedly had its influence. I must confess that the televised audience with the Mert of Venus and the Znam of Mars did make Terra's president, should I say late president, look a bit seedy. I dare say there is such a thing as a too common man. Kyle was such 20 years ago. His name wasn't Kyle then, although it was something very like that. I must see if any of the old ledgers are about. I'd like to see what the Imperator's name was when His Most Imperial Majesty was an apprenticed nobody. October 12, 2119, New San Francisco. I found it, buried in the stacks of dust behind the old printing press that was once the heart of my Beacon Sentinel. There were others there, too. Spent a delightful morning with them, reading back through those old account books. I wonder whatever happened to Hastings and Drew. Best linotype man I ever had. They became pilots or something, as I recall. Too bad, too bad. They could have had such brilliant futures, both of them. Why they felt they must ally themselves with the non-thinking, muscle-flexing variety of mankind, of which our new ruler is an excellent example, I'll never know. Ah, yes, Kyle. In those days he was Kilmer Jones. I don't remember him too well, actually, except the day I fired him. I suppose he was right in changing his name. We couldn't very well have an imperator named Kilmer the First or Jones the First. Much too common, not at all in keeping. Gawky fellow, that Kilmer. When Bard brought me a sample of his work, I guess I'll have to call it that, we both had a good laugh over it. Atrocious spelling. Couldn't follow the proofreader's marks. Indeed, I wondered if the fellow could even read. The punctuation and the grammar. I called the boy into the office that morning, or was it the next day? No matter. I called him in and told him, as kindly as possible, that I thought there were other vocations to which he might be better suited. The irony of it all. Kilmer Jones, Kyle the First. And he stood there, I remember, with those 17-year-old hands that were all knuckles and bone and chapped skin, twisting those hands and shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Please, Mr. Booth," he said, his voice cracking, "I ain't got no other job in mind. I want to be a newspaper man. I ain't got no—" If not for that "ain't got no," I think I might have relented. But no one is going to ruin the English language as he did. Not in my offices. I took him to task severely for his offensive usage, outlining a correct example of what he had attempted to say, gave him a brief lesson in the history of the tongue, and explained why it had been chosen as the official Terran speech. I think my conclusion was, "You'll be much better off in a position which requires you to quote neither Milton nor Shakespeare, nor any author save possibly those who write the comic strips." "Got no training," he said softly. I suppose it was to keep his voice from exhibiting its usual adolescent gymnastics. I shuddered slightly. I remember. "You mean I have no training?" "Yeah," softly again. "Yeah, Mr. Booth." "Yes," I cried impatiently. "Not yeah, but yes." I searched for his severance pay on my desk, wondering who the devil had hired him in the first place. Gave him 3 weeks' pay, as I recall, one more than necessary. Unmannerly pup, he just stood there for a minute, and then finally left without even a thank you or goodbye. And this is the man who is Kyle the First, ruler of Terra at the age of 37. I wonder what he is like now. January 1, New San Francisco. There is no longer any need to wonder. Surprisingly, few heads have rolled, but apparently Jonesy chose to exhibit his power in other ways. Thanksgiving Day, a custom preserved in certain portions of the Directorate of North America, is 3 weeks away, even though it is January. The year 1. There used to be some childish joke about the year 1. Don't remember it just now. Thanksgiving harvest in January. Christmas celebrated in February. Spring planting in July. To say nothing of the inconvenience this has caused my bookkeeping department. I suppose the man will now try to change the weather to suit his new calendar. January 8, New San Francisco. He can't last. He can't. A dictator is one thing, a monarch is another. But Kyle is something else. Naturally, he had to remove certain persons on his way. And his summer palace in the Plains region of America, that's all right. That's all right. An authority of Kyle's stature is expected to remove undesirables, and have a summer palace, and a winter palace, and anything else he wants. Of course. But why this? Why this of all things? No newspapers. Just like that. He waves an edict, and just like that, no newspapers. The Beacon Sentinel has been a great paper for the last 25 years. It was nothing, and I was nothing, and together we became a voice. And now, again, we are nothing. Oh, I see what's behind it. It's revenge. That's what it is. Because he once couldn't become a newspaper man, he's taking his vengeance this way. A man as petty as that shall be overthrown. Mark my words. And the clumsiness of it. I see what he is. I know him. He's still that pup of 17 playing king of the world, twisting his hands gleefully over his childish triumph. No subtlety. Just a direct pushing over of an apple cart he couldn't steer. Doesn't matter whose apples you destroy, does it, Jonesy? Just push it over. Push it over. January 16, 1. New San Francisco. Closed the Beacon Sentinel yesterday. My savings are enough to take care of me for a few years. After that, well, I'm no longer a young man. I am glad that Elsa is not here to see this. February 12, 1. New San Francisco. Received a letter this morning requesting me to appear in the chambers of His Most Imperial Majesty Kyle I on Tuesday of next week. His Most Imperial Majesty can see me between 10:15 and 10:25 in the morning. 10 minutes. Rather a brief spell in which to roll another head. I find myself amazed, though. Is this man so truly powerful that he needs no police to make arrests for him? Can he really send messages via jet mail and be certain his enemies will not try to escape? I don't want to attempt flight. Life without my work is no longer life. February 17, 1. Kylington Palace, North America. I don't understand. I've gone over it twice and I don't understand. If only Elsa were still with me, I could talk to her. She would help me decipher what it's all about. This morning at 10:15 sharp, I was taken to the public audience chamber in the palace. His Majesty was seated behind a desk facing the doors. Behind him, on the wall, was his coat of arms. He stood up and walked toward me, waving away the guards. "How are you, Mr. Booth?" he said, and offered me his hand. I recovered my presence of mind, of course, and replied as was fitting. And then he said, "I shall be at liberty later this week to discuss more fully the details of these past years." Shades of ain't got no. Meanwhile, my secretary will give you a complete dossier on my planned official bulletin. He lighted a cigarette after offering me one. I should deem it an honor, he continued, to have a man of your literary versatility, and, I must add, your vast practical experience, become chief editor of the bulletin. The publication, which I should enjoy christening the Terran Beacon Sentinel, with your permission, sir, shall be more than my official organ. It shall set the standards for the coming newspaper world. He cocked an eyebrow at me and smiled. I believe we are in perfect accord about certain standards, are we not, Mr. Booth? The deplorable grammatical practices of some newspapers. Well, really, Mr. Booth, I feel assured of your agreement. He led me around the desk and pointed to the coat of arms. As he stood silently, I felt obliged to look more closely. I had seen it before, of course, but seeing it now greatly enlarged, I was able to make out its details. What I had thought was a mere decorative border, I now realized was a motif I had seen all my life. A tiny lighthouse sending forth a beam, the trademark of my paper. As I stood there, gaping, His Majesty laughed softly and said, "That, Mr. Booth, I felt impelled to include, for without your most fortuitous termination of my apprenticeship in your organization, I would not have risen to my present position." Again he took my hand and shook it warmly. His hair was just a bit gray at the temples, and there were signs of strain on his finely featured face. Those awkward hands were now strong and purposeful. He apologized that he must return to his duties, and went with me to the door. My secretary will fill in further details about your new position. Newspapers shall once again be published. No, don't say a word, Mr. Booth. I know what you're thinking. Your salary, he continued, as we stood at the open door, shall of course be commensurate with your high authority in this new field. Allow me, now, to thank you most deeply and sincerely for your unwitting aid in my youth. I assure you, Mr. Booth, I have often thought of the day we talked, and I hope to repay you in some measure for what you did. He said more, mostly polite phrases of goodbye, and then I was outside after being handed a folder by some man. An official jetmobile took me to my residence, which turned out to be in the East Wing. Here I am, and I don't understand. I came prepared to suffer heaven only knows what as part of Kilmer Jones' childish pattern of revenge. Instead, here am I, head of the official bulletin, titular ruler and ruler in fact of the future journalism of the world. There is something behind this. I keep feeling there is. But what? What? Or is he truly generous to a degree never before known among absolute monarchs? February 13, 1. Kylington Palace, North America. I am a suspicious and most humble old man. I see now that Kyle's generosity amazed me only because I myself would have been incapable of such an action. Just now I fear for His Majesty. I was right before when I said there is no subtlety in the man. He is too open, too fair, too forgiving. A ruler of such greatness of heart might easily allow some small, insignificant person in too far, too close. I fear for him. February 14th, 1. Kylington Palace, North America. Today we begin publication. The press room is magnificent. I can hardly wait. It's been a long time since I felt such exuberance. This afternoon I am to conduct a conference of some 800 editors. His Majesty's Secretary has sent me an outline on journalistic standards, which I will study after lunch. There is a note attached, in His Majesty's handwriting. Such beautiful penmanship, too. A mere formality, it says, for of course you and I know full well what the future of journalism shall be, Mr. Booth. Later. How wrong can one man be in one lifetime? I wonder now why he changed the calendar. I wonder now what poor devil he destroyed then. But I'll cheat him. I'll cheat him yet. Obituary, Turin Beacon Sentinel, February 16th, 1. The unfortunate and untimely demise of George W. Booth is hereby noted with sorrow for those who knew him and loved him. Mr. Booth, former editor and publisher of the Beacon Sentinel of New San Francisco, Directorate of North America, had apparently been in the poor health for some time. It is believed that the worry over the success of his new policy setting Turin Beacon Sentinel was a contributing factor to his suicide late in the afternoon of February 14th. His Most Imperial Majesty Kyle I is ordained a fitting monument to his limited friend. A simple shaft of granite shall be erected in the garden facing the west wing of Kylington Palace, where Mr. Booth made his residency. On that shaft shall be inscribed the legend, "How bounteous mankind is, all brave new world that has such people in it." The quotation is from The Tempest. Mr. Booth was a great admirer of Shakespeare. A vin more fitting and long-lived memorial is expressed in the relace through the office of His Majesty on the very day of Mr. Booth's death. It reads in part, "The new linguistic policy on Tura, as demonstrated in the Turin Beacon Sentinel, shall henceforth be known as Booth Talk. Mr. Booth befriended our imperial ruler in his younger days, and as we all know, His Majesty never forgets a friend." End of With a Vengeance, by J.B. Woodley.
Zeritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Zeritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. Why bother building a time machine when there's something much easier to find right in your own kitchen? Somebody, someday, will make a study of the influence of animals on history. Although not as famous as Mrs. O'Leary's cow, Mrs. Graham's cat should certainly be included in any such study. It has now been definitely established that the experiences of this cat led to the idea of quick frozen people, which, in turn, led to the passage of Zeritsky's Law. We must go back to the files of the Los Angeles newspapers for 1950 to find the story. In brief, a Mrs. Fred C. Graham missed her pet cat on the same day that she put a good deal of food down in her home deep freeze unit. She suspected no connection between the two events. The cat was not to be found until 6 days later, when its owner went to fetch something from the deep freeze. Much as she loved her pet, we may imagine that she was more horror than grief-stricken at her discovery. She lifted the little ice-encased body out of the deep freeze and set it on the floor. Then she managed to run as far as the next-door neighbor's house before fainting. Mrs. Graham became hysterical after she was revived, and it was several hours before she could be quieted enough to persuade anybody that she hadn't made up the whole thing. She prevailed upon her neighbor to go back to the house with her. In front of the deep freeze they found a small pool of water and a wet cat, busily licking itself. The neighbor subsequently told reporters that the cat was concentrating its licking on one of its hind legs, where some ice still remained, so that she, for one, believed the story. A follow-up dispatch, published a week later, reported that the cat was unharmed by the adventure. Further, Mrs. Graham was quoted as saying that the cat had had a large meal just before its disappearance, that as soon after its rescue as it had dried itself off, it took a long nap, precisely as it always did after a meal, and that it was not hungry again until evening. It was clear from the accounts that the life processes had been stopped dead in their tracks, and had, after defrosting, resumed at exactly the point where they left off. Perhaps it is unfair to put all the responsibility on one luckless cat. Had such a thing happened anywhere else in the country, it would have been talked about, believed by a few, disbelieved by most, and forgotten. But as the historic kick of Mrs. O'Leary's cow achieved significance because of the time and place that it was delivered, so the falling of Mrs. Graham's cat into the deep freeze became significant because it occurred in Los Angeles. There, and probably only there, the event was anything but forgotten. The principles it revealed became the basis of a hugely successful business. How shall we regard the Zeritsky brothers? As archvillains or pioneers? In support of the latter view, it must be admitted that the spirit of inquiry and the willingness to risk the unknown were indisputably theirs. However, their pioneering, if we agree to call it that, was, equally indisputably, bound up with the quest for a fast buck. Some of their first clients paid as high as $15,000 for the initial freezing, and the exorbitant rate of $1,000 per year as a storage charge. The Zeritsky brothers owned and managed one of the largest quick freezing plants in the world, and it was their claim that converting the freezing equipment and storage facilities to accommodate humans was extremely expensive, hence the high rates. When the early clients who paid these rates were defrosted years later, and found other clients receiving the same services for as little as $3,000, they threatened a row, and the Zeritskys made substantial refunds. By that time they could easily afford it, and since any publicity about their enterprise was unwelcome to them, all refunds were made without a whimper. $3,000 became the standard rate, with $100 per year, the storage charge, and no charge for defrosting. The Zeritskys were businessmen, first and last. Anyone who had the fee could put himself away for whatever period of time he wished, and no questions asked. The ironclad rule that full payment must be made in advance was broken only once, as far as the records show. A certain young man had a very wealthy uncle residing in Milwaukee, whose heir he was, but the uncle was not getting along in years fast enough. The young man, then 18 years old, did not wish to waste the best years of his life as a poor boy. He wanted the money while he was young, but his uncle was as healthy as he was wealthy. The Zeritskys were the obvious answer to his problem. The agreement between them has been preserved. They undertook to service the youth without advance payment. They further undertook to watch the Milwaukee papers until the demise of the uncle should be reported, whereupon they would defrost the boy. In exchange for this, the youth, thinking of course that money would be no object when he came out, agreed to pay double. The uncle lived 17 years longer, during which time he seems to have forgotten his nephew, and to have become deeply interested in a mystic society, to which he left his entire fortune. The Zeritskys duly defrosted the boy, and whether they or he were the more disappointed is impossible to imagine. They never forgot the lesson, and never made another exception to their rule. He, poor fellow, spent the rest of his life, including the best years, paying off his debt, which, at $3,000 plus 17 years at $100 per year, and the whole doubled, amounted to $9,400. The books record his slow but regular payments over the next 43 years, and indicate that he had only $250 left to pay when he died. We may, I think, assume that various underworld characters who were grateful ex-clients of the Zeritskys were instrumental in persuading the boy to keep up his payments. Criminals were the first to apply for quick freezing, and formed the mainstay of the Zeritsky's business through the years. What more easy than to rob, hide the loot, except for that all-important advance payment? Present yourself to the Zeritskys and remain in their admirable chambers for 5 or 10 years, emerge to find the hue and cry long since died down and the crime forgotten, recover your haul, and live out your life in luxury? Due to the shady character of most of their patrons, the Zeritskys kept all records by a system of numbers. Names never appeared on the books, and anonymity was guaranteed. Law enforcement agents, looking for fugitives from justice, found no way to break down this system, nor any law which they could interpret as making it illegal to quick freeze. Perhaps the truth is that they did not search too diligently for a law that could be made to apply. As long as the Zeritskys kept things quiet and did not advertise or attract public attention, they could safely continue their bizarre business. City officials of Los Angeles, and particularly members of the police force, enjoyed a period of unparalleled prosperity. Lawyers and other experts who thought they were on the track of legal means by which to liquidate the Zeritsky empire found themselves suddenly able to buy a ranch or a yacht or both, and retire forever from the arduous task of earning a living. Even with a goodly part of the population of Los Angeles as permanent pensioners, the Zeritsky fortune grew to incredible proportions. By the time the Zeritsky brothers died and left the business to their sons, it was a gold mine, and an inexhaustible one at that. During these later years, the enterprise began to attract a somewhat better class of people. Murderers and other criminals continued to furnish the bulk of the business, but as word of this amazing service seeped through the country, others began to see in it an easy way of solving their problems. They were encouraged, too, by the fact that the process was painless and the firm completely reliable. There were no risks, no accidents, no fatalities. One could, in short, have confidence in the Zeritskys. Soon after Monahan's great exposure rocked the nation, however, many of these better type clients leapt into print to tell their experiences. One of the most poignant stories came from the daughter of a Zeritsky client. Her father was still, at the age of 102, passionately interested in politics, but the chances of his lasting until the next election were not good. The daughter herself suggested the deep freeze, and he welcomed the idea. He decided on a 20-year stay because, in his own words, "If the Republicans can't get into the White House in 20 years, I give up." Upon his return, he found that his condition had not been fulfilled. His daughter described him as utterly baffled by the new world. He lived in it just a week before he left it, this time for good. She states his last words were, "How do you people stand it?" Some professional people patronize the Zeritskys, chiefly movie stars. After the exposé, fan magazines were filled with accounts of how the stars had kept youthful. The more zealous ones had prolonged their screen lives for years by the simple expedient of storing themselves away between pictures. We may imagine the feelings of their public upon discovering that the seemingly eternal youth of their favorites was due to the Zeritskys and not, as they had been led to believe, to expensive creams, lotions, diet, and exercise. There was a distinctly unfavorable reaction, and the letter columns of the fan magazines bristled with angry charges of cheating. But next to criminals, the majority of people who applied for quick freezing seems to have been husbands or wives caught in insupportable marital situations. Their experiences were subsequently written up in the confession magazines. It was usually the husband who fled to Los Angeles and incarcerated himself for an appropriate number of years, at the end of which time his unamiable spouse would have died or made other arrangements. If we can believe the magazines, this scheme worked out very well in most cases. There was, inevitably, one spiteful wife who divined her husband's intentions. By shrewd reasoning, she figured approximately the number of years he had chosen to be absent, and put herself away for a like period. In a TV dramatization rather pessimistically entitled "You Can't Get Away," the husband described his sensations upon being defrosted after 15 years, only to find his wife waiting for him right there in the reception room of the Zeritsky plant. She was as perfectly preserved as I was, he said. Every irritating habit that had made my life unbearable with her was absolutely intact. The sins of the fathers may be visited on the sons, but how often we see repeated the old familiar pattern of the sons destroying the life work of the fathers! The Zeritsky brothers were fanatically meticulous. They supervised every detail of their operations, and kept their records with an elaborate system of checks and double checks. They were shrewd enough to realize that complete dependability was essential to their business. A satisfied Zeritsky client was a silent client. One dissatisfied client would be enough to blow the business apart. The sons, in their greed, overexpanded to the point where they could not, even among the four of them, personally supervise each and every detail. A fatal mistake was bound to occur sooner or later. When it did, the victim broadcast his grievance to the world. The story appeared in a national magazine, every copy of which was sold an hour after it appeared on the stands. Under the title, "They Put the Freeze on Me," John A. Monahan told his tragic tale. At the age of 37, he had fallen desperately in love with a girl of 16. She was immature and frivolous, and wanted to play around a little more before she settled down. "She told me," he wrote, "to come back in 5 years. And that started me thinking, in 5 years I'd be 42, and what would a girl of 21 want with a man twice as old as her?" John Monahan moved in circles where the work of the Zeritskys was well known. Not only did he see an opportunity of being still only 37 when his darling reached 21, but he foresaw a painless way of passing the years which he must endure without her. Accordingly, he presented himself for the deep freeze, paid his $3,000 and the $500 storage charge in advance, and left, he claimed, written instructions to let me out in 5 years, so there'd be no mistakes. Nobody knows how the slip happened, but somehow John A. Monahan, or rather the number assigned to him, was entered on the books for 25 years instead of 5 years. Upon being defrosted and discovering that a quarter of a century had elapsed, his rage was awesome. Along with everything else, his love for his sweetheart had been perfectly preserved. but she had given up waiting for him and was a happy mother of 2 boys and 6 girls. Monahan's accusation that the Zeritskys had ruined his life may be taken with a grain of salt. He was still a young man, and the rumor that he received 100,000 for the magazine rights to his story was true. As most readers are aware, what has come to be known as Zeritsky's Law was passed by Congress and signed by the President 3 days after Monahan's story broke. 75 years after Mrs. Graham's cat fell into the freezer, it became the law of the land that the mandatory penalty for anyone applying quick freezing methods to any living thing, human or animal, was death. Also, all quick frozen people were to be defrosted immediately. Los Angeles papers reported that beginning on the day Monahan's story appeared, men by the thousands poured into the city. They continued to come, choking every available means of transport, for the next 2 days, until, that is, Zeritsky's Law went through. When we consider the date, and remember that due to the gravity of the international situation, a bill had just been passed drafting all men from 16 to 60, we realize why Congress had to act. The Zeritskys, of course, were among the first to be taken. Because of their experience, they were put in charge of a military warehouse for dehydrated foods, and warned not to get any ideas for a new business. End of Zeritsky's Law by Anne Griffith.